Hello. Hi, everybody. Nice to see all of you. Hi. We're going to start because it's 1 o'clock and we live stream these and people are watching our live stream. So I think you all know who I am, but I'll introduce me. I'm Samira Al-Qasim. I'm the program manager here at the Jerusalem Fund. And thank you for coming to this event. And thank you, those of you online who are tuning in. We're happy to share with you today a recently published nonfiction novel by author Charles Sutherland called Prisoners of History, the story of Dalia, a Palestinian, which is about a Palestinian girl who, like over 100,000 Palestinian children, are trapped as prisoners in the military occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, who struggle for food, electricity, and education and freedom. This short, disturbing, fact-based narrative is based on official Israeli policies, secret police tactics, real-life events, and authentic episodes experienced by actual people. In this story, Dahlia explains the oppression and obstacles she and her little brother endure and their efforts to become educated under Israeli military rule. Through the telling, disturbing details are revealed about the thousands of Palestinian children physically harmed, killed, arrested, and imprisoned, including a special Israeli military court for children. The interviews of Dalia are conducted by 3 composite journalists from the US, the UK, and Israel, who provide an ongoing analysis and fascinating new insights of a biblical history, philosophy, and politics of the military theocracy of Israel. Now, much of this, what I've just told you, is from the cover of the book. So, I will tell you a little bit about our speaker, the author, Charles Sutherland. He comes to this subject from his own independent research and lived experience. He was educated at schools and universities in the US and Europe, including the University of Vienna and the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has been an international businessman for over 30 years, with travel to over 67 countries, and has launched a variety of corporations and philanthropic organizations in the US, Europe, including the Soviet Union, and the Middle East. He's also been Director of Development of the Washington Times and author of numerous articles and several books, including Disciples of Destruction, The Religious Origins of War and Terrorism, Character for Champions, Red Tape, Adventure Capitalism in the New Russia. He was a co-author of that. Clash of the Gods. He was also co-author of that. The Poison Planters, Sowing the Seeds of Global Genetic Genocide, and many other books, including Reflections of a Boy Growing Up in Nebraska in the 1950s with an Irish Catholic Father. So let's welcome our speaker, but before that, I'd like you to know we're selling copies of the book over there. They'll be available for purchase and signing after the talk. Thank you very much. Let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you, Samira. Shukran. So, ladies and gentlemen, friends, and any Aipac people who are listening, after that introduction, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say here. Because of a problem I had when I was a child, it's difficult for me to project my voice. So if you can't hear me, just raise your hand. It's been a long time since I've given any remarks in public, but as I remember the ground rules, my job is to talk, and yours is to listen. So if you happen to finish before I do, just leave quietly. I have to make sure I can read my notes here, because my eyesight is less than my insights. My book, Prisoners of History, the story of Dalia, a Palestinian, looks through the eyes of a Palestinian girl who describes the official policy of Israel, which is to destroy the children of Palestine. The book derives its name, Prisoners, from the Israeli-British author Ilan Pappé, the historian, who wrote a book called The Biggest Prison on Earth, because of the Israeli military machine, which is keeping 5 million Palestinians prisoners on their own land. To make the disturbing facts in the book easier to an audience, there's wit and humor throughout the course of the book. Part of it, part of it's because my nature, we're Scotch-Irish, which means we laugh, cry, and fight, not necessarily in that order. And part of it is because I wanted to give the readers a respite from the horrible details that are in the book itself. Let me just move this around here. However, because of the unpleasant nature of what I'm going to talk about today, I won't use any wit or humor in the book itself. I'm neither Palestinian nor Jewish, and therefore I have no inherent wisdom from osmosis, from being part of ethnicity or religion. But I tell people over the years that those who observe the fishbowl can see the fish have in a broader perspective than the fish who live inside. In the past, I've also been a student of history for many, many years. Since 1975, I've been to Israel about 20 to 30 times, been to Palestine 10 times, and I've met people and have befriended people on all levels of society, including I had private meetings with Ehud Omer, the former mayor of Jerusalem and former prime minister. I had private meetings with Meron Benvenisti, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. I had private meetings with Yasser Arafat, the former former president of Palestine, and many private meetings with Hannah Nasser, the mayor of Bethlehem. So I've known a lot of these people. I should point out at the beginning of my remarks that most Israelis are not Zionists. In fact, they're very sympathetic to the Palestinians. I should say many. Many Israelis are not Zionists. Indeed, several of the leading pro-Palestinian organizations, like Peace Now, for example, have been set up by former Israeli military officers who were appalled by what they had to do or what they had to observe. Also, many Christians would be shocked to realize that over 40% of Jewish Israelis are secular, even agnostic or atheist. They're only Jewish by cultural tradition, not by religion. However, for ideological and financial reasons, many of them are also Zionists. And being agnostics and atheists, they are particularly enjoyful of the irony of receiving billions of dollars every year from the American Christians. To provide an overall perspective of the book, I'll just give you one philosophical note from the author's note of the book. Samira told me I should occasionally refer to the book to make sure that you know I wrote the book. And I always do what women tell me to do. So, in a book in the 1980s, I wrote, "In humanity's early struggle to comprehend its existence, it was easier to invent sin than to invent science. As a corollary, in modern geopolitics, it is still much easier to conceive a religious justification for violence and oppression than to provide a secular explanation. Religious justifications merely require blind believers who are willing to suspend thought and sympathy. Secular explanations involve the effort of rational evaluation and the impulse of compassion. Religious enemies can always be portrayed as evil, deserving no mercy. Villains in a secular society, however, need only be brought to justice. Believers have always vastly outnumbered thinkers. In the West, the history of belief has always been a history of brutality, usually against the weak, the ignorant, and the innocent. In the names of their gods, some Middle Eastern desert religions are now committing atrocities against the next generation of Palestinian children. Some who are sitting on their sand dunes, the ancient deities of the desert, are laughing. Now, the central theme of the book is that Israel's policy is to systematically destroy each generation of Palestinian children. The purpose, as part of Zionism, is to destroy the Palestinian culture and to force the Palestinians into exile in order to create Eretz Israel, the biblical Israel. The secondary theme is that the American and financial and military support of Israel's national policy of child abuse is because of religion. We all know from the last 3,000 years of history that the forcible spread of religion always involves mass murder, and it involves crushing or converting the next generation. In the 13th century, the Muslims put a pause on their jihads. In the 19th century, the Christians halted their global efforts at religious wars. However, in the mid-20th century, religious expansionism began once again in the hot deserts of the Middle East, the cradle of religion, the most violent place in human history, which for some curious reason is called the Holy Land. First, some background, and those who are familiar with this, those who were here are familiar with it, but many people watching this may not be. The philosophy of Zionism is stated clearly by David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel. He said, quote, "It must be very clear that there is no room in this country for both people. There's no room here for compromises. There's no room in no way but to transfer all Arabs from here to the neighboring countries, close quote. Following his direction, in 1948, to create Israel, the Zionists destroyed over 500 Palestinian towns and villages, drove hundreds of thousands of Palestinians off their lands. Sometimes the Zionists even took over Palestinian homes which are fully furnished, including dishes and sheets and beds. Of course, the Palestinians call this event the Nakba, the catastrophe. On the other hand, the Zionists call it the Tahur, the Hebrew word for the cleansing, as an ethnic cleansing. However, since the Zionists did not succeed in cleansing all the people from the land, the constant removal process has been continuous, unrelenting, and violent. As pointed out by historians, World War II ended European colonialism, but there was one final orgasm. After World War II, the final seeds of colonialist ideology were ejaculated from Europe, as victims of the war began to populate Palestinian territory and through a violent cesarean section created the newborn child, the State of Israel. However, the newborn child was born with religious rage and uncontrollable aggressiveness. In 1956, Israel, less than a decade old, invaded Egypt and tried to seize the Suez Canal. In 1967, less than 2 decades old, the adolescent child continued its religious rage of fit and seized the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the West Bank from Jordan. Then in 1982, the adult Israel invaded Lebanon. Except for 1956, when President Eisenhower stopped them, the Americans have continued to permit or to rationalize Israel's aggression, which has obviously led to justifiable animosity from many in the Muslim world. But there is a reason why Israel knew it could always rely upon American support. During the 1967 war, the USS Liberty, an American spy ship, was off the coast of Gaza, monitoring the communications of the war. Israel realized that the Americans would soon learn of its intention to invade Jordan. So what did Israel do? Israel attacked the American ship and tried to sink it, and tried to blame it on the Egyptians. In the process, Israel killed 34 Americans and wounded 174 more. How did the U.S. react? President Johnson was a Christian and did not want to embarrass Israel. So when he was alerted, he tried to stop any U.S. naval help from coming to the rescue of the fellow sailors. But members of the U.S. Navy are brothers, not politicians, and so they came anyway, several of whom jeopardized their careers to do so. Then afterwards, LBJ covered up the entire matter. The man in charge of the cover-up was Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., the father of Senator John McCain, who continues the cover-up. This is all documented in many books and will soon be made into a movie, and I know a number of the people involved. Now, this history is essential to know because the massacre of American military personnel by Israel with impunity had serious long-term implications. Israel observed that American Christians were willing to overlook the slaughter of fellow American citizens by Israel on the high seas in international waters. Thus, Israel correctly concluded they could do anything to anyone else at any time, anywhere in the world, and the U.S. government would not object. And they have not, and the Israelis have done that anything. They defy United Nations resolutions, they invade neighbors, bomb foreign countries, conduct assassinations all over the world, including in Europe. And despite constant international objections, with American government and financial support, Israel implemented a national policy of child abuse to destroy the children of Palestine. Let me pause to put the American religious theme in perspective. Most of the founding fathers of the United States were agnostics or deists, which is why they created a government to separate the church and state, to protect the new country's citizens from the religious tyranny of the various branches of Christianity in Europe. After the founding of the United States, Christian power in Europe began to decline. After the 18th century American Revolution, the French Revolution destroyed the power of the church in France, and in 1870, the nation-state of Italy arose, and the Vatican lost its army. The Christians lost their military power, which they had possessed for 14 centuries. In the United States, that sublimated missionary zeal of American Christians manifested itself in a global policy to spread democracy around the world. However, after World War II, the Christians were blessed with another opportunity to flex their religious muscles. In 1948, European religious colonialism spread its divine wings again, seized land from the peaceful native people of Palestine, and created the ethnic religious theocracy of Israel. It should be noted that in the 1950s, despite the agnostic founding fathers, American Christians began to obtain political power, and so they called the United States at that time a Christian nation. Congress then added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and added the words "in God we trust" to the paper money. American Christians then began to regard Zionist Judaism as a 20th century continuation of the Christian Crusades into the Muslim world of non-believers, and began to channel their messianic Christian spirit into financing and arming the new pseudo-religious nation of Israel. Thus the Zionists became the military proxies and divinely sanctioned gladiators of the discontented American Christians, who now finally had an opportunity to use military power to embark upon their own crusade. Now back to the principal theme, removing all Palestinians. Israel achieved military domination of the territories it invaded, but it now had a problem what some people in history would call the Palestinian problem. In 1948, ethnic cleansing was still a political practice. However, in 1967, the civil rights movement was blossoming in the United States, so past practices were off limits. Israel could not legally annex the conquered territories or call the people prisoners of war. That would have created too many official violations of the United Nations Charter, which even the United States could not ignore. So what was Israel to do? Israel called the conquered areas the Occupied Territories and called the people inhabitants. Occupied territories was a vague legal term, and as inhabitants, the Palestinian people have no rights. They are merely the residue of primitive non-white natives on a colonized territory. And we know from recent events with the Ethiopian Jews that the Israeli government does not like black people very much. The issue then became how to remove these troublesome inhabitants. So Israel fell back on David Ben-Gurion's policy of transferring. Even though transferring itself was now declared illegal in 1949 by the Fourth Geneva Convention, ironically, relating to the Nazis transferring Jews in Europe. Nevertheless, Israel forcibly removed tens of thousands of Palestinians from their homes, put them in buses and trucks, and transferred them to the border of their neighbors, like Ben-Gurion had ordered, mainly Jordan, and simply dropped them off like cattle. As expected, LBJ and the United States did not object to this blatant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention or to the United Nations Human Rights Charter. Indeed, for decades, the U.S. would tacitly sanction Israel's violation of UN Resolutions 242 and 338, and never compel Israel to return to its legal borders, and never require the return of Palestinian refugees to their home. However, at that time, in 1967, modern television was expanding globally, and reporters were now everywhere with cameras. Thus, there was not time to forcibly remove several million people from their land, without publicly tarnishing Israel's phony humanistic image of being history's helpless victim. So Israel had to develop another policy. The new policy became the policy of self-deporting. Israel would make life so miserable for Palestinians that they would self-deport and leave the country forever. Israel has employed many methods to achieve this goal. The most pernicious and brutal was to torment the children of Palestine, so their parents would protect them by taking them out of the country forever. This leads me to the strategies of the book, as seen through the eyes of Dalia, a Palestinian, in a series of interviews with three composite journalists, one American, one Brit, and one Israeli, all of whom provide their own journalistic perspective on the issues. Israel's national policy of child abuse. The first step to destroy a generation of children is to prevent their education. In 1967, when Israel seized Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the education system had been run by Egypt. Once Israel controlled it, it was a combination of Egyptian and Israeli policies. Israel kept it so confused that no student could possibly ever achieve an education. Similarly with the West Bank. Before the 1967 war, the education system was controlled by Jordan. Once Israel controlled the land, the education was a combination of Jordanian and Israeli policies, with a deliberate scheme to prevent any viable educational system. Then, over the next 25 years, despite the natural growth of the Palestinian population, hundreds of thousands of children being born, Israel would not permit any new schools to be built. Now, there are statistics on this, and I'm quoting from the book now, because Samira told me to quote from the book. This is these are actual facts. There are three journalists. One is Sham, the American journalist. One is Eliana, the Israeli journalist. One is Alicia, the British journalist. And Dalia, of course, is a Palestinian. Were there any statistics on education, Sean asked. Not until 1991, when the Tamar Institute of Community Education conducted a study, Eliana responded. It showed young Palestinians knew almost no arithmetic. Only 24% of the students in fourth grade could even measure with a ruler. Only 73% of them could even add 1/2 and 1/4. The study also revealed that sixth grade reading comprehension in Palestinian schools was only 30%. By 2004, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, UNRWA, worked with the Palestinian Authority to enroll almost 400,000 students in schools. About 1/4 of them in schools provided by the United Nations, half of them in schools provided by the Palestinian Authority, and the others in private schools, mainly Christian schools. End of the quote from the book. Now, since Israel no longer controlled the school system because the United Nations was now involved, they had to develop a different plan, one to interfere and disrupt education, even the schools of the United Nations and the Christians. Thus, Israel decided to close schools whenever it chooses, including the Ramallah Friends School of the Quakers and even Bethlehem University, the Catholic college set up by the Vatican in 1973. These closings can last days, weeks, months, or years, and they have. Israel also arrests teachers routinely. During the Intifada, when Israel closed Palestinian schools, teachers invited their students to their homes for classes. Then the Israeli military and secret police, claiming teachers were creating terrorist cells in their homes, invaded the homes, arrested the teachers and some of the students, and confiscated all the teaching materials and books. Israel also requires Palestinians to have travel passes to go anywhere. To enforce these passes, it sets up military checkpoints, now hundreds of them. Apart from disrupting Palestinian life, these checkpoints prevent or delay students, teachers, and professors from getting to school on time or at all, and disrupting classes at all levels, including college. Israel also censors books and literature, intercepts reading materials, and destroys libraries. Israeli policy also prohibits students from forming clubs on campuses of any kind, arguing that such clubs could become terrorist cells. To the Israelis, for a Palestinian to still be alive and studying is itself an act of terrorism. And of course, the final coup de grace is that Israel continually demolishes the school buildings themselves. European school governments often finance the construction of Palestinian schools. Israel often waits until the schools are built, then claiming the schools did not have a proper building permit. The military shows up with bulldozers and trucks, demolishes the schools, hauls away the computer equipment, software, laboratory equipment, desks, and chairs and books. As you may be aware from last year on a very publicized event, the military waited until the first day of school when a new school was built in the West Bank by the government and people of Belgium. The military demolished the school and hauled away everything in the trucks. The only thing that remained was a concrete floor, and of course the hopeful little children watching as the soldiers destroyed their new school on the first day of class. Israel also closes colleges, destroys laboratory equipment, libraries, and hauls away computer equipment from the colleges. The military also damages the plumbing and toilets to make it impossible to have sanitary conditions whenever they allow the schools to reopen. And if a student wants to attend a college in a different town, even if a short drive away, the student must obtain additional travel permits, which are required of all Palestinians to travel anywhere, even short distances. Another approach to destroy the future of Palestinian children is to totally dismantle the family structure, both immediate and extended families. The objective is to totally eradicate the Palestinian culture. There are many methods involved. The first is to destroy the children's respect for their parents. This is done by humiliating parents in any way possible. Sometimes it is at the military checkpoints where parents are ridiculed and physically abused in front of their children. And it's also by stopping cars on the road and making everyone get out and stand for hours in the heat, while arrogant young Israeli soldiers, particularly young female soldiers, ridicule Palestinian fathers in front of their children. Another way to violate the sanctity of is to violate the sanctity of Palestinian homes themselves. The military or secret police, the Shin Bet, can go into any Palestinian home at any time, day or night. Often when they enter the homes, they ask for customs receipts and other receipts for the merchandise. They maintain the official pretense that they are checking to see if these items are smuggled in from abroad. If a receipt is not produced which satisfies the soldiers or the police, they confiscate the items. If they are new items, instead of destroying them, the Israeli soldiers take them to their own homes to supplement the low salary paid by the army. Now, when children see the impotence of the parents and are deprived of televisions, radios, and electronic items in this age of iPads, they are obviously upset, and of course they disrespect their parents. Of course, the most effective way to violate the sanctity of the home is to demolish the homes themselves with bulldozers and dynamite. Excuse me. These include homes of parents whose children or even relatives are accused, not tried and convicted, but simply accused of anti-Israeli activities. To the Israeli government, any anti-Israeli act is a form of terrorism, requiring the entire family to be punished. Their home demolished and have them put onto the street to become a burden to their other relatives. The Israeli Committee Against Housing Demolitions, an Israeli group, has reported that there have been over 43,000 Palestinian homes destroyed by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. This also makes it difficult for children to attend school on a regular basis because they're now moving around from place to place trying to find a place to live. And of course, often those parents and relatives are arrested and put in administrative detention. Administrative detention, as you surely know, is when Palestinians or even Israelis are arrested and put into prisons or camps in the desert for as long as Israel chooses, without any trial and without even being charged with a crime. They can languish there for days, weeks, months, or years. If the persons arrested and imprisoned are the wage earners of the family can starve, which is obviously part of the purpose for doing it. The hope is that the families will then abandon their relatives in prison and leave the country. To prevent mass starvation of the children in the family, the Palestinian Authority tries to provide financial assistance to these families. Of course, the Israelis then tell the press and the world that the Palestinian Authority is rewarding terrorists and financing terrorism. These policies are all to totally dismantle and disrupt and eradicate the Palestinian family and culture, and make all relatives outcast in their own extended family circles, to discourage anyone giving any relative any support or help of any kind, lest their own home be demolished unless they go to prison themselves. The hope is that to protect the children, the parents will leave and take their children out of Palestine. There's one other thing the students must fear, and that's called internet activism. If a Palestinian or a liberal Israeli posts something on the internet which is offensive to Israel, the person can be arrested and sent to prison or administrative detention for internet activism without a trial. And of course, their computers, laptops, and software are confiscated. Israel claims that these students are cooperating with international terrorists on Facebook and Twitter by saying something critical of Israel on the internet in a public forum, and therefore they must be stopped. Using this rationale, the Israeli authorities also seize the computers and softwares of the Palestinian colleges and even prevent college professors from going online to do research. These internet activism arrests occur almost daily. There are over 400 a year. One notable example was Doreen Tatur, who is also mentioned in the book. I'm going to quote from the book again. "Oh yes," Dahlia reacted quickly. The poet Doreen, this is all true by the way, the poet Doreen Tatur was accused of incitement to violence because she had posted a poem critical of Israel's occupation on YouTube, and she read a poem on Women's Day in Nazareth. Well, what happened to her? Well, she spent 3 months in 3 different prisons, Kishon, Damon, and Hasharon, Dalia answered, She was released from prison, but then she was forbidden to come within 40 kilometers of her own home. Israel claimed that she was now a danger to her own community due to her opposition to Israel's occupation. Well, if she couldn't go home, what did she do? Well, her parents were forced to rent an apartment for her in Tel Aviv for 6 months to live. Later, the judge allowed her to be under house arrest at the family home in Nazareth. Well, does the world know about her? Sure, Dahlia snapped back. 10 Pulitzer Prize winners and dozens of leading American literary people, including many recipients of the Guggenheim Fellowship, openly protested. Noam Chomsky and 250 other writers, intellectuals, and artists wrote an open letter. Almost 7,000 people later signed the letter, but Israel doesn't care. End of quote. By the way, if a student is convicted of internet activism, he or she can be banned from going to college. That forces them to leave the country. Also, what people don't know excuse me, is that hundreds of Palestinian children are arrested every year, or simply picked up, namely kidnapped, when they're unaccompanied or outside playing in different neighborhoods. Their parents are then forced to look for them. Israel claims that children walking in different neighborhoods are on scouting missions for would-be terrorists, so they are picked up. Under Israeli law, children 12 years and older are criminally responsible. The Palestinian Commission of Detainees and Ex-Detainees recorded that in 2016, 1,384 children were arrested and 505 detained, scores of whom were under the age of 16. On average, between 500 and 700 children are detained every year, 86% of whom experience some form of violence while in custody, including being shackled during interrogation while forced to sit or stand in awkward positions, kept in solitary confinement, or being physically and verbally abused. So many children have been kidnapped, arrested, or incarcerated that in 2009 the Israelis set up a special military court just for children. Note, it's a military court, often behind closed doors, where the judge and the prosecutors all wear military uniforms to dispense the Israeli version of justice and apply Israeli military law, which is often in violation of international law. And the success rate of the Israeli military court is 99.73%, according to the United Nations. Obviously, all this brutality toward children creates permanent psychological damage. Of course, in the West Bank, the Jewish settlers often poisoned the wells of Palestinian families. And then the children must walk to distant neighbors to obtain water for cooking or other uses. Along the route, the Jewish settlers call them vile names and throw stones at them. En route, the children must also pass olive groves of trees which were uprooted by the Jewish settlers or by the Israeli military. Olive trees which have been on these lands for centuries, providing food and income for Palestinians. Tens of thousands of olive trees have been destroyed in a further attempt to totally eradicate the Palestinian culture of their grandparents. Of course, most people are not even aware that there are hundreds of towns, villages, and streets which have had their names changed from Arabic names to Hebrew names to totally obliterate any Palestinian history. As Meron Benvenisti once remarked, quote, "The Israeli erasure of Palestinian history was consciously as complete as possible." Close quote. One of the most insidious methods of creating insecurity in young children and eradicating the Palestinian society is to disrupt electricity and sanitation services. This causes health problems, problems in cooking and preserving food, plumbing problems in the home, raw sewage in the streets, and contaminates the water supply. Another method is to isolate people by cutting telephone services so that people in need cannot contact each other. Children then know that if they need help, they will not be able to call anyone. So one can only imagine what it's like to grow up as a child in Palestine. Israel has created a monster, a population of angry, uneducated, psychologically damaged young people. The only wonder is why they're not more terrorists. Of course, one rebellion of the youth, and one of the biggest, as against their parents, was the Intifada, the uprising, when the young people openly shouted that they would not become Israel's slaves like their parents, and so they rose up to protest and to throw stones. We know that resulted in Prime Minister Rabin's Iron Fist policy, ordering the army to break the arms and legs of thousands of Palestinian children so they could not protest or throw stones again. Then, once convicted of being a terrorist for throwing stones, the Palestinians were considered dangerous. Therefore, they could not be allowed to go to school again. This meant, of course, they have to grow up uneducated or try to leave the country or never return. Other traumas which children must observe or when Israel makes their relatives, even in ambulances, wait for hours at military checkpoints to bring injured family members or pregnant mothers to the hospital, many of whom die while waiting, including the unborn babies and the mothers. And we all know that if a Palestinian is wounded by an Israeli bullet and taken to the hospital by relatives, those relatives can be arrested for aiding a terrorist. Often when there is a tragic death, the Israelis won't allow the family to have the corpse for a funeral because they fear that a funeral will become an occasion for an anti-Israeli demonstration. Since the policy of self-deporting has not been totally effective for the Israeli government, Israel has now embarked upon another domestic policy, the policy of self-destruction. We're all aware of the psychological studies with the rats, whereby rats live in a confined area with limited food, and every few days an additional rat is added until they finally turn on each other and try to eat each other. The analogy is appropriate for Israel since many Israelis regard Palestinians as animals. Prime Minister Golda Meir famously constantly referred to Palestinians as dogs, and the current Israeli Minister of Justice, Aipac, once posted on her Facebook page that Palestinian children are little snakes. And she's the Minister of Justice. The point is that, like confined animals, Palestinians are being made to fight with each other. The broad policy is to create tension between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. The internal fighting between Palestinian politicians has become so vicious that what happened is the Palestinian Authority joined with the government of Israel to reduce the electricity in Gaza to only 4 hours a day. That happened last year. The hope is that the people of Gaza will then abandon Hamas as their political leaders and throw their political support behind the Palestinian Authority, which, despite the public perception and press, has a very close working relationship with the government of Israel. After all, the Palestinian Authority was set up with Israel's cooperation as a consequence of the phony Oslo Accords. Many people don't know it, and when I mentioned it, you will see how obvious it is for a police state. For decades, the Shin Bet has had various Palestinian leaders on their payroll in one way or another. Also, the relationship between leading Palestinian politicians and Israeli government is close because Israel allows and even assists the financial corruption of Palestinian political leaders by helping them salt away money in foreign bank accounts which they collect from abroad. The objective is to co-opt and contaminate the political leadership of Palestine and destroy any possibility that these corrupt politicians will in any way represent the Palestinian people. I'll conclude with two final points. One is that the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem estimates that the cost to the Palestinian economy of Israel's military oppression is $10 billion a year. Without the oppression, the Palestine would become a thriving economy, which of course is exactly what Israel is trying to prevent. It is also estimated that the cost to Israel of maintaining their military and secret police oppression is over $1 billion a year. Of course, the annual money to finance this oppression is coming directly from the U.S. Congress, money that could be used to rebuild American cities instead of destroying Palestinian ones. It should be noted that the U.S. Congress, dominated by Christians, is borrowing billions of dollars from China, dominated by atheists, to support the Jewish religion in Israel to oppress the Palestinian Muslims. Talk about a screwed up world. Next, while publicly opposing the possibility of a two-state solution, behind the scenes Israel is fostering that political mirage. Why? Because they know it will never happen. Over 30 years ago, I met privately with Maron Benvenisti, and he personally told me that a two-state solution was just a political fiction promoted by Israel. While the politically corrupt Palestinian politicians are arguing for a fictional two-state solution, Israel has turned the ghetto of Gaza into a complete garbage dump, which the United Nations now says will, in a few years will be uninhabitable. And while these decades-long phony peace conferences are played out for the public and the press, Israel has totally fragmented the West Bank, with hundreds of Jewish settlements and Jewish outposts, military checkpoints, Jewish roads that Palestinians cannot use or even cross except at certain locations, as well as the apartheid walls, and of course the prisons. Because of these territorial fragmentations, Palestinians cannot even go meet each other, let alone create a viable government. The West Bank has become so shredded into so many parcels of real estate that it is now impossible to have a contiguous Palestinian nation. The corrupt politicians of Palestine are well aware of this, but they enjoy their personal power and the money and fame they get to obtain from it. So what's the answer? In my view, the Palestinians long ago should have rejected this two-state solution nonsense and demand citizenship in the State of Israel, with the right to vote and to participate in the social welfare program that the United States pays Israel billions of dollars a year to maintain. If this were to happen, the Muslim nations would be pressing to make this a peaceful reality and might even finance it, since they already finance certain things in Palestine anyway. If that were to happen, the American Christians would then have a dilemma. They would have to decide whether they want to promote American democracy or to finance and militarize the religion of Moses. One final parenthetical point: it's not just the Palestinians who are involved in self-destruction. When you're in Israel, you often hear the joke that anytime you have 3 Israelis together, you get 5 opinions. And years ago, when I walked along the streets of Caesarea with an Israeli general, he pointed at the Roman aqueducts, and he reflected the Hebrews have had 5 or 6 commonwealths in their long history, and the Hebrews always self-destruct. If these aqueducts could talk, he would say, as an Israeli general, I can tell you the Hebrews just screwed it up again. Close quote. I will say that in my view, for various reasons, including the corruption which you all witnessed, Israel is imploding. To summarize the book, Israel openly acknowledges that the objective of its military democracy of National Socialism and Zionism is to remove all Palestinians and to create an ethnic theocracy. That, after all, is why it's called the Jewish State of Israel. To do this, for decades they have openly committed brutal atrocities against Palestinian children. This cruel inhumanity seems to be acceptable to what we euphemistically refer to as the civilized world, because these brutalities are perpetrated under the guise of religion, which we all know from history always justifies brutality in the name of some divine mission. Let me close with a brief perspective. Everyone knows that anyone who criticizes Israel is labeled an anti-Semite in order to silence them. Obscured by boisterous name-calling is the fact that Semites are the people from the biblical Shem, those who speak the Semitic languages. There are currently over 250 million Semites in the world. So to be a true bona fide anti-Semite, you have to be very educated, since it requires the knowledge and capacity to hate a lot of different people for different reasons. On the other hand, the worldwide Jewish population is fewer than 15 million people, less than 6% of the world's Semites. However, you will be surprised to learn that the vast majority of that 6% are not even Semites. Professor Shlomo Sand, the famous historian at Tel Aviv University, wrote a book entitled The Invention of the Jewish People, in which he points out that the entire Hebrew narrative is just a literary invention to create a unified history and political entity. He explains that at the beginning of the 20th century, nearly 80% of the Jewish population had no Semite blood, since they were all descendants of the converts from the Jewish kingdom of Khazar in the region of now southern Russia, which existed from the 7th until the 10th century, and from where most of the Jews of Europe emigrated. These were all religious converts, and they were not a consanguineous people. They had no bloodline. Israel itself was founded by non-Semite Jewish population from Europe. In addition, since the creation of Israel in 1948, there have been hundreds of thousands of sabras, children born in Israel, born to these non-Semitic people. Therefore, when you add the original non-Semite population and the non-Semitic offspring, probably over 90% of the Jewish population of Israel is not even Semitic. On the other hand, Palestinians are all descendants of the Phoenicians, all of whom are Semites. Therefore, since the non-Semite European population of Israel is oppressing the Semitic Palestinians, ironically, it is the Jewish population of Israel who are the world's largest group of anti-Semites. So my job is finished, and you know, not walk out on me. Thank you very much.
a question and a comment. The real reason these politicians are pro-Israel is nothing to do with Christianity. It's the Israeli lobby, and I would also bring up the military-industrial complex. Israel is the only country where all of our aid that we give is military, not financial. And when you give any military aid to another country, they're required to spend about 77% of it on military products made in the United States. So you've got those people running those industries like Boeing and whatnot who give donations to these politicians. And as for Aipac, I've seen interviews, one with Cynthia McKinney, another was an older man who had been a Republican from Chicago, and both of them said, people from Aipac came in your office, and the only thing they cared about was your views on Israel. And if they didn't like the answer, they said, we will spend millions and millions of dollars to make sure you are not reelected. That is the problem. It's a bought and sold Congress. I also had a question, not Palestinians, but the Israeli Arabs. I've always heard that they've been treated very second-class citizen. And also getting back to, you mentioned the Khazar thing, you know, because they're Turkic people. I've always heard that the Sephardic Jews are Semitic and that they have been treated as second-class citizens in Israel as well. Does the book address any of that?
Yeah, let me try to remember what you just said now. Regarding the military-industrial complex, for sure, Aipac, which is, for those who don't know, is a Jewish lobby. They're very powerful. They destroy anybody who gets in their way, period. They destroyed American senators, congressmen, companies, everybody. They have enormous power. They're the strongest lobby in Washington, probably. They bought and paid for many congressmen. However, they would not be, if this were Poland and they were a lobby, they wouldn't be able to pull that off. The reason they can pull it off is because they appeal to the American Christians who are defending the helpless Jews in the Muslim world. So you could apply the same model or paradigm.
Not that long ago, many Christians referred to Jews as Christ killers. So
Not in the 20th in the 20th century. If you were to have a political lobby, as we all know, there are many political lobbies from foreign countries. They don't enjoy the same power that Aipac does. It's because there's a religious component. on the what was your second point?
I was asking about, well, you addressed the Aipac and the military industrial complex, but the Arabs, the Israeli Arabs, and the Sephardics.
Okay, the Sephardics. Yeah. Generally speaking, the Sephardics are technically from Spain, right? But they're really the dark-skinned Jews from the south. The Ashkenazis are typically the European Jews. They're the ones who mainly were the converts from the kingdom of Khazar.
Well, it was the Caucasus.
Yeah, Caucasus. But
it was Central Asia.
Well, Shlomo Sand is a professor of history from Israel University, so I'm saying what he is describing. In any case, what happened is the Ashkenazis are the ones who created Israel. And they always discriminated against the Sephardic Jews for being dark-skinned. And Sephardic Jews had to struggle in order to receive scholarships in Israel because they were oppressed by the Ashkenazi Jews of Israel. Sephardics were always a second class of Jews. And of course, the Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, have been way down below that. As far as the Arab population, they're Arab citizens and Christian citizens and Druze, so the Druze population in Israel. They are all second-class citizens in one way or another. They cannot achieve certain levels in the Israeli Defense Forces or intelligence community because since they're not Jewish, they can't be trusted. Right? So they have a status and they can achieve things, but they do not have the same status as the Ashkenazi Jews. It's just not possible for them to do that. Were those your three questions, or?
Yeah, that was pretty much it.
Okay. Since I'm interested in American politics, CUFI, does that ring a bell?
Who?
CUFI.
No.
Citizens United for Israel. Or maybe it's Christians United for Israel. Founded by a pastor in San Antonio, Texas. Has grown to millions and millions and millions of members, very heavily Southern-based, but not exclusively. Meets in D.C., has a major convention every year. They make Aipac look like wimps. When Rand Paul gave his little speech opposed to all foreign aid, they inundated him with telegrams sufficient that he made a second speech and said, except for Israel. So they made Rand Paul change his tune. Now, I was going to ask you to comment on Kufi's role in maintaining congressional support for Israel, but if you haven't heard of it, I guess I can't.
I don't know. I can tell you, though, over the years, I've met people from AIPAC. I knew a number of people in AIPAC, including some leaders of AIPAC. And in fact, I knew some of the people when the FBI and the Justice Department indicted 11 Israelis for spying for Israel. I knew some of those guys who were indicted. I mean, so they not only do everything they can to support Israel, they also do whatever they can to undermine the United States, and they help steal secrets from the United States and give them to Israel. I mean, that's common knowledge. But my point is that they can do that because there's a religious component to that. You could not get the same thing in other countries which have far bigger military and economic presences. For example, China. You would think that China, with all of its billions of dollars, in fact, they own over $1 trillion of our debt, and they have 150,000 students at our universities on their laptops stealing our information. You'd think that with all their power, that they would have some power equivalent to AIPAC. The reason they don't is because they're communists and atheists, whereas Israel is part of the Judeo-Christian heritage. So there's a strong religious component which makes all that possible. That's the oxygen which allows them to do all that.
Well, that's why you don't know about Kufi. You really should check it out. They're Christians, but I can tell you that I heard Pastor Hagee, who is a Christian minister, speak at AIPAC, and he got more applause than any other speaker at that particular conference. So,
well, like I said in my remarks, the Christians, this was a windfall, because when the Vatican lost its army in the 19th century, the Christians who had dominated the world for 14 centuries, well, dominated the world for 11th century, they started in the 4th and 5th century, and they were everywhere. They had military people all over the place, but then they lost all of their power. Within 1 century, they lost all their power. So for them to find somebody who was willing to become their gladiators in their armed forces, it was a divine blessing for them. And it was in the 50s, as I mentioned, the founders of this country, most of them were agnostics or deists, and so that's why the separation of church and state. It was in the 1950s that the American Christians finally began to develop some power, and because they had been sub rosa underneath, because the U.S. was a secular society, the Christians had kept their head down low. They stayed under the radar until the 1950s. And then Israel, Zionism came in the Middle East, and then that's when the Christians had Congress pass the "In God We Trust" and "Under God" and the Pledge of Allegiance. That's when they started to feel their oaths, and increasingly then evangelical people came, and they became very strong and very powerful, and they're the biggest supporters of Israel. Ironically, it's the American Christians more than the disparate American Jews who support Israel. There are several Jewish groups, like Jews for Peace, for example. They don't support Israel. And of course, the Orthodox Jews defy Israel. They think Israel is a blasphemy because only God can create a state. To have a secular state is against the laws of Moses. So it's the American Christians who are pulling this off, even though the AIPAC is dominated by Jews, obviously. It's the American Christians who are making this all possible.
Thank you. I heard that about 55% of the Jews in Israel are of Arab origin.
No.
No?
No, I think the Arab population of Israel will probably be about 15%, something like that.
Well, you mean the Palestinians?
Israel.
I mean the Jews who immigrated from the Arab world to Israel after the founding of the state.
Oh, I see. No, because when they did the statistics, and I read Professor Sand's book on the whole thing, he's the one who discusses and gives these statistics on how how many of these people are there. The Sephardics, they tried to keep the Sephardics out. I mean, that was why, one of the reasons why Menachem Begin couldn't come to power, right? Because he was from that group. He was supported that group. They tried to keep the Sephardics out, so what? I mean, it's hard to know for a lot of reasons. I mean, Israel has a policy which say it's part of their racial policy. In the, I think it was 2002 or 3, when they passed the law saying that if you were Jewish, you could not be married to a non-Jewish and have citizenship. Therefore, a lot of non-Jewish spouses had to leave Israel, which meant that their Jewish spouses left too. It was sort of revert to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, if you remember, your biblical history. That's when Ezra and Nehemiah declared that all foreign wives had to be ousted because the Jews were marrying too many non-Jews, and so they got rid of all foreign wives. But I don't know what the current statistics are of Arabic blood, or what you call Arabic blood, because I mean, even the term is a misnomer. Technically Arabs are from Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah.
And the Muslims are something different completely, because the Persians are Muslims, ISIS is Muslim, so they're totally different groups. So the answer is I don't know specifically the numbers. I'm just referring to Professor Sand's evaluation.
I mean the Jews who came from Morocco and Syria and Iraq and all this.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers.
Thank you.
Yeah, if the people in Israel are not Semitic, well, I mean, if the Jewish people in Europe are not Semitic people, where are they from?
Well, they were from Eastern Europe. They're Slavs.
They're mainly from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, they're Slavs.
And
In the Caucasus, they're from the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. It's in the southern area, southern Russia area. It's the Caucasus and that area.
and they're converts.
They're converts.
They're not originally from.
No, the Jewish community set up a kingdom called the Kingdom of Khazar in the 7th century, and in the area of the Caucasus, what is now southern Russia, right? They set it up in the 7th century, and it lasted for several centuries. A lot of Turkish people were there, a lot of other people were there, but they became Jewish by conversion, not by blood. And so when the Jews migrated to Eastern Europe and to Western Europe, they were from there. They weren't from the Middle East.
Okay. So they weren't ever from Israel.
Well, maybe the ones who started the process were, but then who knows? But there had to be some Jews around who knew about it to start the process. But according to Shlomo Sand, that at the beginning of the 20th century, 80% of the Jewish community on the planet Earth were non-Semitic.
They had a war with Russia.
Huh?
They had a war with Russia, the Khazars, and Russia destroyed their kingdom.
Yeah,
And
Russia has a tendency to do that.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you cover this because it's sort of off the trail. Are you aware of the transfer agreement between the Zionist Party and Adolf Hitler?
I read the book by Edmund Black.
Okay.
What she's referring to, Edmund Black was a survivor of Holocaust, Jewish from Holocaust. He wrote a book called The Transfer Agreement, in which it's a fascinating book, in which he discusses that the foundations of Israel were laid by Hitler, including the Anglo-American Bank, which was set up in bank, which is Bank Leumi now, was originally Anglo-American Bank, was a bank set up by Adolf Hitler, because Hitler wanted to get, Hitler liked Jews in a bizarre sort of way at the early days, because they were white-skinned and they were smart. And he did not like the Muslims in the Arab countries, so he wanted to send these white-skinned people to the Middle East to work as agents for the Nazis. And then they wouldn't cooperate, then he changed his approach to the whole subject. The transfer agreement discusses how Hitler laid the economic and political foundations for Israel. It's fascinating. Another thing people don't know, most people don't know, is the principal supporter of Israel. When Israel was to become a state, the principal supporter was Joseph Stalin, because he wanted two things. And number one, when the British were leaving Palestine, he did not want the Americans to show up in Palestine. So he wanted socialism to be in Israel, which is what he created. So he sent a lot of socialists to Palestine to create Israel, meaning that he would help create Israel as a socialist kingdom and keep the Americans from having a warm water port in the Mediterranean. That would keep the Americans out and get the British out. Stalin also had a problem with the Jews, as we know. He had a big problem with the Jews, largely because most of his colleagues were Jews. When the Bolshevik revolution began, 89% of the Mensheviks were Jewish and 90% of the Bolsheviks were Jewish. So Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, they're all Jews. Trotsky's real name was Lev Bernstein, right? Bronstein. They were all Jews. And so when they got into a fight with Hitler, he saw all of his enemies were Jews. So he wanted them out of there. So he decided to help set up the Jewish state in order to get rid of the Jewish competition in the Soviet Union. I mean, so history has lots of strange wrinkles to it. That's why it's hard to project, because there's so many underlying currents. All right?
Yeah, what was the name of the book you just mentioned?
Which one? The transfer agreement?
Transfer agreement.
Transfer.
It was in 1933.
Okay, that's by Edwin Black. Edwin, I think. Edwin Black.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Charles Sutherland. And
Pleasure.
we can buy copies of the book over there.
Okay.
And let's give him another applause. Thank you.
Thank you.